for all congressmen, for all cops. And winning with the workers of the world. There is the elite and the dispossessed, and it's only about survival. Who has skill to play the game for all it's worth. And reaching out still got perfection. Let's try and keep as much emotion out of this as possible. Let's try not to remember any names. We'll do it for country, for people, for more vision. United we'll make them remember our history. Or how we like to be told. And we like to be told. And we rock because it's us against, and we found our own reasons to sing. And it's so much less confusing when lines are drawn like that. When people are either consumers or revolutionaries, enemies or friends, hanging on to the fringes of the content system. It's just about knowing where everyone stands. All of a sudden, people start talking about guns, talking like they're going to war. 'Cause there's not something to die for. Start taking back what they stole. Show me, tell me how their options. Doesn't make a difference how we get it. Would you really fucking get it? No, 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 through the best of times, through the worst of times, through Nixon and through Bush. 236, we went our separate ways. You fought for Stalin, I fought for freedom. You believe in authority, I believe in myself. I'm a Molotov cocktail, a Dom Perignon, baby, what's that? Confused look in your eyes, what I'm trying to say is that I'll burn down buildings while you sit on a shelf inside of them. You call the cops on the looters and pythons. They call it class war, I call you co-conspirators. 'Cause baby, I'm an anarchist, you're a spineless liberal. We march together for the 8-hour day. Held hands in the streets of Seattle. When it came time to throw bricks through that Starbucks window, you left me all alone. All alone. You watched an eye at the red, white, and blue on the 4th of July. While those fireworks were exploding, I was burning that fucker and straining my back by eating the peanuts that the parties held tossed you in the backseat of your father's new Ford. You believe in the ballot, you believe in reform. You have faith in the elephant and jackass, and to you solidarity is a 4-letter word. We're all hypocrites, but you're a patriot. You thought I was only joking when I screaming go away at the top of my lungs. The cops and the cars and the men in the suits. Now I won't take your hand and marry the state. 'Cause baby, I'm an anarchist and a spineless liberal. We march together for the 8-hour day and held hands in the streets of Seattle. When it came time to throw bricks through that Starbucks window, you left me all alone. All alone.
Yo, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the podcast. My name is Jeremy, and this is Divergence Media. Tonight, I think we're going to take a little stab at a thing called statism. I think this might be a hard pill for a lot of you guys to swallow. I know it was for me, and I've got two people here with us today that were actually a big help in me actually coming to this awareness that statism is somewhat, in my mind, a sort of a mental disease that is just you're unable to escape. It is wrapped up with doublethink. There's so much to it, but I don't want to get into too much involved with that. I have with me tonight one of these guys and Debo, their special guest on the show. Most of you probably know these guys if you're listening to this show, but we're going to go into detail and hopefully try to kind of debunk some of the ideas that people have of anarchy or volunteerism, of these punk rock guys with mohawks on the street with Molotov cocktails and baseball bats trying to riot the streets and destroy cities. That, of course, is not it at all. And that's sort of the picture that's been painted throughout punk rock songs, and just the terminology itself is always sort of abused in that manner. So, let me just say hello to our guest tonight, one of these guys, and Debo. How are you all doing tonight?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm good. Been working all day and looking forward to getting here with you guys.
I think I'm doing just fine.
Fantastic. Now, also with us, we also have Popeye and Cliff, which are two regulars here. How are y'all?
Hey, everybody. How you doing?
Good morning or good evening.
Right.
Right. It's evening for us in the U.S. and just depending on where you guys are or whatever it is, hope you're having a good day. So yeah, I mean, where do we start with this, guys? I guess let me, if you don't mind, let me just kind of give you a starting point where I'm at, where I started and how I went through. I'll kind of give you just a short, brief history on how I came out of statism and into, I suppose, what you can call volunteerism or anarchism. For a very long time, this was my state of mind. It is that government, of course, is bad, right? It doesn't matter who you vote for. You're all you're voting for the bankers. You're voting for just corruption in general, right? I think a lot of us can probably agree that government politicians lie, and so but yet, even though I point out all of these terrible things about government, somehow or another, I still justify the need for that establishment. I in my mind, I still say, yes, these people are horrible, but we have to have them. Obviously, that's a form of doublethink, is it not? To say that they're very bad, but we have to have them. It just doesn't really make any logical sense. And we'll, of course, get into more detail on that. But it took me a long time to come to that conclusion. And the main things that held me back was fear. It was the fear that, oh my God, what are we going to do if we don't have these people to protect us? That is until you realize that they don't actually protect you. Oh my God, what are we going to do without public education? Until you realize that education would probably be better off without them, right? It's a lot of these things that I had a challenge with in my mind. And so, of course, when we get to, thinking about anarchism or volunteerism, it's all these little small questions that pop up in your mind. What are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about that? Tonight, what I hope we can do is just get down to the core principles and then let you work some of those out in your mind. So I'm going to pass it over either Debo or one of these guys, whichever one of you two kind of want to lead off, maybe with an opening statement on what maybe some of your core principles of why you believe what you believe.
Well, in response to your statement that these are bad guys, but we got to have these bad guys, and it's sort of hyperbolic, but it's sort of truthful at the same time, right? Sure. I like to phrase it as, well, it's not a perfect rapist, but it's the best rapist we've had today, right? And that brings it to the forefront that these people actually mean to harm you. They mean to rule you, right, for their own benefit.
That's like saying the lesser of the two evils, but you're still picking evil.
Absolutely. And as far as voting goes, or even, campaigning for, a politician of some type, say a political candidate, are you not literally campaigning for evil?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah, and of course, in my estimation, you're pretty much culpable when you back somebody, even if there is an issue with being able to prove via the voting or whatever, because that's a whole other issue. But the fact that you have verbally, outwardly expressed your support for somebody, you're pretty much expressing that you don't give a shit what they do. You're supporting it all.
So let's pass this over to Cliff here for a second. Cliff, what I would like to hear from you, because you sort of champion this cause of not joining groups. And so this really ties into the left-right paradigm of government and not joining groups. Can you maybe discuss that basic principle?
Sure, yeah. It is obviously, all of this is a very deep rabbit hole, because when people use the word government, the logic in that is to say, what do you mean by government? Do you mean individual self-government? Do you mean de facto corporate government? Do you mean global government? What do you mean? Because government, I prefer to, when I talk about external government, I tend to talk about it as the system. It's the system. Why?
Okay.
Because the system is has government as one part of the system. In other words, the true global system, you have government as just a part of it. What people would term government. If we go outside that little box of what people call government, we get other influences, which technically could be deemed as governing bodies. So government, therefore, on an external level, is external influencing, manipulation, suggestion, hypnosis, all the manipulative tactics, almost like a corporation selling someone something. So if we go back to individual self-government, well, now we've got a whole different ballgame, because how can one learn what true self-government is by people outside yourself hoping to tell you what their version of government is, which could be infinitely long, and as we would or could assume, a lot of people out there have an agenda, So my to cut to back what you're saying. So my understanding of it basically is that when people, it seems to be in human nature that we are what they call gregarious. We form groups. It starts with the family and it goes out. So then to get it more solidified, they have uniform, which is one form. And so now you're in a more of a type of almost religion, because now you've got more boundaries, and therefore you'll find people in uniform have a limited view of thinking, and it is technically a religion. So now we're getting into the whole thing of religion. As I said before, there's other parts to government. So why I advocate for individualism is not particularly saying you must be an individual at all costs. That why I preach a lot of individualism, and a lot of people get this wrong if they're not used to it. They think, that's the be all end all. It's just to get people to get back to yourself, to ask yourself these questions. Stop looking outside the world, taking in everyone's opinion and religion. Start to think for yourself. Start to question everything, of course. And then we start to come to the realization, God, I know nothing, and these are stupid ideas, and one thing can lead to another, and then hopefully it'll lead to self-governance, which can only really be done on an individualistic level.
Right, and it's okay that if you agree with other people, right? It's not that when you say you want people to be individuals, it's not as if you're saying it's okay to agree with other people. But what becomes dangerous, of course, is that groupthink mentality that at a local level, say in the United States at least, any form of government, they rely on that groupthink and sort of that religiousness that you have about government, and to make them even legitimate to begin with. Because their legitimacy is manifested in your mind. It's not as if there's really anything feasible except for the threat of violence against your life by a police officer. But other than that, it's all manifested in your mind. So they really are relying on that exact groupthink and a lack of individualism in order to substantiate their very presence.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, then there's the threat of force with a certain group cult. And on a very surface level in most countries, they've got the Democrats and the Republicans, or they've got the nationalists and the labor unions, which are totally different. So, yeah, they're opposite ends of the spectrum. So, whichever power gets in, and this is total surface level, then there's going to be the nationalists or Republicans that say, this really sucks. I've got the socialist government in. And all the socialists go, yeah, now it's going to be more leaning towards our ideology. So it's an ideology. And therefore now it's assumed that the whole group, and this is why it's dangerous with groups, the whole group now, whether they know it or not, because a lot of them don't care, they're just going, yeah, I agree, without even thinking. So the group will force its opinion and ideology onto others.
Sure. I want to pass this over to Debo for a moment. Debo, we really haven't heard much from you yet tonight. Sorry about that. Maybe give us an idea of maybe some background. When did you decide that this was the right path? I mean, what led you to it? And even now, what kind of give us an idea of why you believe that volunteerism is the only form of society that you would accept? Or is it?
Yeah. First of all, I guess I'll define what I mean, or what my understanding is of anarchy, and it comes from an, or without, and archon, or rulers or masters. And I just think it's a consistent viewpoint that I rule me and you rule you, or sort of like the golden rule, to treat other people like you would want to be treated. And I've even spoke with police officers, and they agree with this. Whether they practice it or not, I don't think so. But I came to this point of view when a family member of mine was attacked, being charged with a nonviolent victimless criminal allegation, and I put myself in their shoes, and I realized, well, how would I defend myself against this happening? Because my family member didn't hurt anyone at all. It's just, well, you broke our rules, allegedly. So I found Mark Stevens' work, and through that found Mark Passio and Joe from Hawaii and Bao and Robbie, lots of other people.
So it was definitely a personal experience, though, that set you down that road. And I understand that you actually do some sort of activism too, right, with law enforcement?
Yeah. Basically, I modeled the questions after Mark Stevens' work, and get the police to agree, well, is it your position that if I'm physically in, like, Wisconsin, for example, the Constitution and laws of the state apply to me? And of course they agree. And then, well, do you have any kind of factual evidence to show that's true? And then you'll get the dodges and attacks and interruptions and all of that.
So for me, and any of you guys, maybe feel free to expound on this, but for me especially right now, I don't think any of us have an illusion that tomorrow government is the rug of government is just going to be ripped out, and tomorrow morning we're going to wake up and there's going to be no government, aside from some sort of absolutely massive catastrophic event. That's likely not going to happen, right? But for me right now, it is absolutely a set of principles to live by, and to say that I can live individually as an anarchist according to anarchist principles, and not necessarily expect that the government that exists on the country that I live in, however you define those words, that it'll suddenly be gone. Of course, there's repercussions for that. But what does it mean for you to, individually, to say that you're an anarchist? Are you advocating for the removal of government as soon as possible, or is it more of an individual lifestyle?
I'd say that it's the removal of government by other people, and they do this by means of force or coercion. And it's also on an individual level. It's taking responsibility for your own thoughts, emotions, and actions, because ultimately, when it comes down to it, you're responsible for it. And I think that's what makes this idea of government appealing to people. It's that they can abdicate their own responsibility and their own consequences of their own actions to other people, and say, oh, well, it's not my fault. I was just following orders, or, oh, well, I'm just following the law. It's like a safety blanket or a safety net.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that actually affects the mindset of everybody, doesn't it? I mean, to think that for a large majority of just daily activities that we would tend to have to deal with without the existence of government, we no longer have to be held accountable for those things. We can just rely on big government up there to handle those things for us. And so we just sort of let those things go. And there are certain aspects that I was thinking about today. Let's just say, for example, public education, right? For a large portion of things, we don't, a lot of people just don't take responsibility for their children's education because they send their children off to school and they trust that that'll be handled there, and they come home, and if they have homework, at best they'll make sure that their kids do their homework, and they think they've done their part. But they've handed over their children's minds, the molding of their children's minds, to a government establishment. I think that's just one example, but
Well, yeah, and if you ask most parents, hey, would you leave your child with a stranger? They'd say no. Well, who do you send your children off to for 7 or 8 hours a day? Who are these people that are molding the minds of your children? And who do they work for? They don't really have an answer.
Right. So maybe let's backtrack just a little bit, and maybe I'll pass this one over to Popeye, because he's the legal expert here. Popeye, can you explain to me what gives government any legitimacy as far as I am concerned? Why does anything that they have to say apply to me?
Well, in the real world technical sense, for the most part, it doesn't. That's one of the biggest keys to all of this, is the ambiguousness of it, along with a couple other small factors we could cover later. From the realistic sense, it doesn't. To quote a former prosecutor, when quietly aside, not within earshot of others, what real evidence is there of jurisdiction? His straight out answer, verbatim, was there is no jurisdiction, evidence of jurisdiction. The only evidence of jurisdiction is the gun.
Now, for those unfamiliar, can you kind of define what jurisdiction even means?
Jurisdiction is essentially the so-called authority, so to speak, to hear controversies and to deal with the remedies. And of course, in a real world sense, this is one of those caveats to the whole thing that we're talking about here. And I'm coming from the standpoint of been a statist, gone through this whole thing, anarchy, so on and so forth. And ultimately, I'm in agreement with all of it. The part that I still see a need for is to administer certain services, particularly, getting roads paved, picking up the trash. I know a lot of this stuff is all privatizable, which most of it already is anyway. That's the thing. It already is. Most of the contractors are private contractors. It's just something called the city that's scooping about 90% of the so-called revenue. If you follow the money, and anything that was taken in was paying out tomorrow, which it's not. Anything that's paid in today is going to interest. So that's a whole nother issue on money in itself. But from the legal technical standpoint, there really isn't. There really isn't anything there. They have to get you to agree, and in certain ways do it, and most people don't recognize how it's being done. And of course, there's a multitude of different ways, and it starts at a young age, like you guys were talking about with the education. You touched on one of the biggest issues right there, is the fact that the children are going into the hands of complete strangers. We don't know anything about these so-called teachers. That we can go in and meet them, and they can say whatever they want. Talk is cheap, but you don't know what they're really saying when you're not there. You have no clue.
Right.
And of course, they're doing a pretty strict curriculum because it's a government-run operation. So they're going to be pretty much putting out the government rhetoric, and of course putting in their own little twist. And if they're uh, so-called more leftist leaning, then you get a lot of that. If they're more conservative leaning, then you get more of that. And so there's always going to be that little extra. And like you said, you're right. You're letting somebody else mold the mind of your own children. And you're hoping that when they come home for the couple of hours that they're wanting to play, do their homework, eat dinner, and get ready to go to bed, you're going to read or undo something that somebody spent 6-8 hours putting into concrete. Come on, fat chance of that.
Right.
So that, there's a big issue there, and you pretty much touched on so much of it, because this is where the programming and conditioning starts. There's the whole Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Come on.
It's repetitive too, isn't it?
Constantly,
that
every
Pledge of
day.
Allegiance is just, it's repetitive. It's done every day. Even when you consider just the basic concept of what that Pledge of Allegiance means, and you just pound that into someone's mind every day.
Well, think about, just look up those 3 words, Pledge of Allegiance. Look them up in a legal dictionary and find out exactly what it is that you're doing when you're pledging of allegiance to whatever. Sure. Because, and of course, this is the one thing, Cliff likes to talk about the public and the private. And in my opinion, for what it's worth, anything spoken anywhere, and even in a so-called private setting, it's still public. Once it comes out the mouth, it's public. About the only thing that's ever private is the unspoken word, because it stays inside, period. And I say that because at any time, anything that, because it's universal, anything you say can and will be used against you. And we're talking even in private settings. Well, of course, at any time, if anything becomes a so-called legal issue, and everything is based off of whatever, if you're dealing with this so-called government, everything is going to come out of that legal dictionary. It's not coming out of the formal dictionary. So every word you ever use, you might want to look it up in the legal dictionary to find out what it is you're saying in a legal sense.
So let's pull it out of legal real quick. I want to pass this back over to one of these guys, if you're still around here. And what I want to get is kind of one of these guys, if you're speaking to somebody who is totally subscribed to the religion of government, what is your go-to to convince them that government is not legitimate? Or just what do you say specifically yourself to a statist?
Well, I mean, that's a pretty big variable, but I like to bring to their attention, and the way of Socratic questioning, can I give away a right that I myself do not possess, right? And that's how you open up the discussion most times. But you really, it's a case by case basis. I mean, people have different levels of indoctrination. They realize or can recognize at least a little bit of a scam in the system, but they just don't want to believe it. They still think that government is there and is well intended and is looking out for its subjects. But I mean, empirically, that's just not the case now, is it?
Well, let's look at the Constitution. Okay, so let's look at the Constitution of the United States. Why do we rely on the Constitution to give us our rights? Why are our rights not self-evident and inherent without a piece of paper telling us that we have something? I mean, in my mind anyways, if I have to have a piece of paper with fancy writing on it for me to have my rights, then my rights are not rights at all. They are a privilege.
Well, and that goes back to what Debo touched on, right? That's why that document is so dangerous. Because, to quote Spooner, whether it be one thing or another, this much is certain. It's either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. And the reason, in my eyes, for the rapid decline and increased despotism of the current administration is the faith that everyone has put in this document. and absolve their own personal responsibility, that onus of the individual to keep this behemoth in check, right? And surely an individual by themselves is not enough, but in a collective, you could make more of a difference, right?
Sure. Debo, I want to kind of pass that same question over to you to kind of get your perspective as well, because it's an important question, I think, for a lot of people out there, that the Constitution of the United States is the holy grail of freedom, right? And it is like it is blasphemy in the United States to dare talk badly about the United States Constitution. So I don't want to just brush over it. I want to maybe get a couple different angles at this. So in your perspective, why is it dangerous to lean on the Constitution?
I'd say that it creates sort of dependence on other people like that you don't know. So you say, oh, I've got my constitutional rights, this, and you're violating my X Amendment right here. And especially in a situation where you're dealing with a person who claims to be a police officer, that sounds like, let's let a judge decide. So you're handing your life essentially over to a group of people you've never met and never will meet. And it creates this perception that, you have some sort of an obligation to this document, which you've probably never read. Most people have never read it. They have no idea about what it says. And man, that's dangerous. That's like a person saying, I don't want responsibility for my life. I want to hand it over to you.
And I'd like to chime in here at this point too. Double O just said North Korea has a constitution too. And I'd go so far as to say as well, look it up. I've actually received a copy that the Soviet Union, when it was, total dictatorship, communism, they had a constitution as well, a people's constitution.
I'd like to throw something in here real quick too, and this is from an actual conversation about government. And this fella says to me, we need to have government to tell us what's right from wrong. I about wanted to smack this guy upside his silly mug. Mm-hmm. It's like, are you serious? You don't know the basic morals of right from wrong? Like if you punch somebody in the face, you don't know this is right or wrong? Somebody kicks you in the kneecap, you don't know the difference if it's right or wrong? You go and help somebody that's fallen over and you help them up. You don't know the difference if that's right or wrong? You need to have somebody tell you this? Well, it goes beyond that. Really? How does it go anywhere beyond that?
Well, that is an important question, because we do have a rise in postmodernism right now where people are literally challenging every system of ethics, right? And saying that all systems of ethics are essentially, subjective or objective to your surroundings and your culture. So, I mean, basically, just pick one. Maybe one culture says it's perfectly okay to kill everybody, and maybe in another culture it's not, right? So
exactly.
How do we decide? How do we decide what system of ethics we follow in a society without government?
Well, this is a question that you could literally go all the way back to the writings of John Locke and the so-called social contract. I mean, this is a conversation that's been going on for many, many years, hundreds of years. John Locke's coming over on a boat in the Atlantic, writing his best ideas of social contract and covering this very issue, talking about consent and so on, the very thing that we're discussing right here. And basically your tacit consent is if you're in the area and you're using the so-called benefits thereof, then you're kind of consenting to a certain amount of jurisdiction, whatever for other things. And what's that?
I was just going to say people should know what tacit is. Tacit basically goes into implied. You've got the
Yes.
two main ones is tacit procuration, procuration is
Right.
dealing is when someone messes around with your affairs physically, and it's curation because you let it go, and so time cures.
Exactly.
And then
And
tacit acquiescence is when people go silent. And this is important because if the government does something that's a bad for the people with its policies, the politicians will call them, not the government, and then the people go silent. Well, that's tacit acquiescence.
well, one of my favorite quotes by a man they called Benjamin Franklin, who is a very interesting character if you go back and look at some of the things that he did, because it would seem that he was actually not just a double agent, but a triple. He was a spy for the King of England, he was a spy for the King of France, and he was working so-called for the United States of America. He was a very interesting man. And in fact, they initially, from things that I have learned, he was initially offered the position of so-called president before Washington. He told them, no, I want to be postmaster general, because he understood the power of being in that position was far more powerful.
Yeah.
But anyway, this man was quoted as to say, those that will trade essential freedoms for temporary security not only deserve neither, but ultimately get neither.
Yep.
And that's where we're at.
I think
that's literally where we're at.
Yeah. But that really kind of leads back to accountability again, doesn't it? I mean, we've lost the hunger for accountability.
Sure.
I don't think that accountability is something that we should be afraid of. I believe it's something that we should be thirsty and hungry for.
Sure.
We should be after it. We should want it.
Well, and this is part of the distraction, because if you look at, and just as a prime example right now, and I'm not a big sports fan. I used to play athlete. I watched a lot of football in the past, but this guy, Antonio Brown, who's now a kind of a hot item because of some of the things that he's said. Okay. People immediately in the world, the real so-called world, that most of them pay attention to sports. Somebody says something, they start demanding immediate action. He got bounced from one team to another. He's in the game. He's not in the game. He's going to be in the game. It's pretty much immediate. And this guy looks like his career might be very close to ending. You look at a few others along the way, and this is why I like specifically as the analogy for this, because typically in sports, because you're such in the public eye, you screw up anywhere, you're gone.
Mm-hmm.
You're gone, period. And they don't give a shit how hard you fall. And it doesn't matter if you're the team president, you're the team manager, you're the coach, one of the star players. It doesn't matter. Well, the fact is, this is no different than we're talking about business. And just in the same as when I was talking about earlier, I still need to get my roads paved. I still want the trash picked up. And yeah, I want the guy that's expediting that fully accountable. And like, this is the problem, because wait until next time that it vote to try to fire somebody that I know is screwing me right now. If he's my employee. Exactly. And see, this is in the real world. If I'm the boss and he's the employee, I get to walk up to him with a box, say, "Clear your desk, get the hell out now."
Sure. Yeah.
But no, I've got to wait. And of course, on some of these so-called public representatives, they get a lifetime fucking pension. Excuse my French. After they're so-called fired. Come on. When does that ever happen in the real world?
Well, see, the first major problem here is the illusion that you somehow or another have a choice between, on who you vote for. So,
well, yeah,
that's the first problem. But before we get too far down the hole here, I want to get back to sort of a basic system of ethics, and I want any of you guys can probably answer this, but again, for those out there that are just completely unfamiliar with this, I really want to go into detail about the golden rule, because I think that is the holy grail for anarchists. So can we maybe go into detail about what that is and how much that really covers?
Well, I'd like to chime in right here and put it out straight. the original common law based on, and this is where the wording comes from, common logic. The common logic was exactly what we're talking about. And the original basis of common law before it got diluted in the courts and all this other crap was very simply this. There's basically 4 prongs to it. We don't harm or kill each other. We don't steal or damage each other's property. We don't defraud each other in any kind of a business deal. And the injured party, if any of those 3 happen, must be remedied. They must be paid somehow. This is it, period. It's an unwritten, unspoken contract from all to all. You leave me the hell alone, I leave you the hell alone, everything will be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, in reality, we still don't need anything more than that because the human condition hasn't changed. Despite all the technology and everything else, the basic human condition hasn't changed. So if you leave me alone and I leave you alone, everything will be damn fine. In fact, Frederick Douglass said it best, when you strive to put a chain around your fellow man's ankle, you ultimately that chain around your neck, your own neck. And it's true.
Let's pass it over to Debo here for a moment too, because Debo, I kind of want to get your, how do you define the golden rule? I mean, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, so treat other people the way that, you would want to be treated, or so there's
so
no
simple,
double
isn't it?
standards.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wouldn't want somebody else to be threatening me with violence, to pay them, even if their intention was good. So say they wanted roads and I want roads. Well, it's not okay for me to, point a gun at someone's head to make them pay for the roads that I want. If I want roads, then I'll take money out of my pocket or resources and put it towards that myself. I wouldn't want to be robbed to pay for something somebody else wants, so I won't do it to other people. And I won't advocate that it's done to other people by voting.
So
exactly.
Just to play devil's advocate here, okay? So I'm going to be the guy that goes, yeah, but okay, so we all publicly throw in, but the guy down the street, he doesn't want to pay for these roads, so he's not going to pay for the roads. But does he still get to enjoy the benefits of those roads?
Sure. I mean, I'm not going to force him to do it. Maybe if he sees the merit, he'll do it voluntarily or not at all.
Okay.
Well, one of the flip sides to that, and this is one of the things that I had thought about, is maybe the guy down the street, he puts his effort somewhere where I'm not necessarily in agreement, but then ultimately I get and benefit from some of what he's done on the flip side somewhere. Some of that would be considered a little bit of give and take, a little quid pro quo. And it's not necessarily in the contract sense. It's just kind of it back with no binding obligation connected to it. It's on free will and good faith.
So
basically the honor system, really.
So let's look at this. One of these guys, you and me have had some pretty good philosophical conversations in the past. Without a form of government to essentially execute due process, without a government or some sort of organization that can put out due process, that can handle that, how do we have justice?
Well, and that gets into what is justice, right? And it's been contested for millennia, but the thing is, how do you make the injured party whole, right? Mm-hmm. And if it's just some corporate monolith that named itself the state, and you transgressed due to their arbitrary edict, how might you make this thing that relies on reification whole, right? Because it's not of a physical form. Government doesn't really exist, but it does at the same time, right? Because it's nothing more than a gang that has taken that label. And without this entity, due process would be very valuable, right? Because there'd be no one to arbitrarily take that away from you. And in a society without this monopoly on force, these things would be weighed and measured and looked at to a great degree because it's just atrocious to set that aside.
As it is right now, I don't believe that we really have any form of justice. I don't think that we can find justice through the opinion of one man that that just happens to have a fancy robe and has passed the prerequisites to say that he's a judge, and now he gets to judge you, and he gets to tell you that you are either a good person or a bad person, or a jury of people who may are just filled with all kinds of opinions before they ever came in there. So
Yep. I'd say at the a lot of leaders, I think even Abraham Lincoln said that freedom, rests with education of the people, true freedom. And for instance, a foundational thing that a cursory view of the system of what they call law through the US and a lot of the world too, because it does kind of get into international law, would be due process. And particularly, there's at least two types. There's substantive, which is a finished product, you could say, or something that stands, and then there's administrative or procedural due process. So if children were taught procedural due process, if everyone knew that, then we would be an honorable group of people that would understand that procedural due process creates a agreement in a certain sense. So we do have a lot of things within this commercial system, because it is a commercial system globally, that is meant to give the checks and balances for anyone to challenge a perceived wrong with due process. So that could be a whole topic in itself, because it is deep, but that is the foundation of substantiating substance evidence for a standable position of claim, if that makes sense. But how's this? You remember how I was talking this afternoon, and I said it's a bit deeper than that. So let's say that the government educated the children in due process from school to when they leave. So the business runs smoother. There's less fraud, you could say. Now, if that was the case, and we managed to get to quote unquote anarchy through the mechanisms of due process, and you'd have to have public record. Keep in mind, you'd also maybe need to have an enforcement. This is another issue that comes up. You need to have an enforcement of any particular issue that's outstanding that could leave a damage that is proven through due process that is still on the record. It needs to be enforced or corrected or atoned. So let's say that we get into a system that works that way. Now, if there's as it is with the people as they are, if you get different classes of intelligence, strength, ability, of understanding, in general being creative, right? Because the whole idea is freedom, and creation is freedom with people. So wouldn't you get a class system in some sense where you would still end up with an elite at the top? So when we look at it that way, if you think about it, because a lot of people haven't thought about it this way, but if you go and think about this concept, technically we already live in anarchy.
That's an interesting concept, I suppose. So it's sort of the natural order of things. It's the natural hierarchy. I think even ancient Buddhism has even went into that, haven't they? That concept of the natural hierarchy that exists.
Yes, and that's something that goes way back to tribal. I mean, way back into ancient history of mankind. And little pods of men, they always look to one guy to be the leader, and it was usually the guy that was the biggest, strongest, could kick the most ass, provide the most food, whatever. Didn't necessarily mean he was the smartest, but that was kind of beside the point, because they always looked for somebody, a strong leader that can go out and fight and defend, and that was the biggest one, defend, particularly if there's any kind of a threat.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes way, 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 way back, and of course, one of the biggest things that Cliff just touched on, but didn't, he almost went there, but I think that it needed to go just a little bit further, and that is teaching children honor, keeping your word. And if you can't keep your word for whatever reason, at least express to the other parties that you've said, hey, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Express why, and have a justifiable reason for it. Don't just be some kind of a flake. Yeah. Oh, I just decided to change my mind. Okay, you changed your mind, but there's a bunch of people hanging on in reliance of what your promise is. And like Cliff just said, if they're suffering damages in reliance of your promise, they need to get some kind of compensation for that. This is just kind of how it is, and this is the real conundrum, because you're really touching on the most essential part of where and how do you deal with this, and the system as it is right now, and for ever since day one, they've always known that this has been a major issue. Mm-hmm. It's written in the court cases. I read them all the time. It's constantly discussed how in one jurisdiction, so-called, this judge rules this way on the same basic item. Then over here in this other jurisdiction, this judge ruled another way. But then there's a third judge that's looking at both of these others and trying to decide with the instant case that's sitting in front of him. And he may decide to go a completely different way than the other two. He may even split the difference.
And what's interesting about that is that all of this is supposed to be justice, right? And so if we're looking at a specific topic, there can really only be one truth. There's only one truth, and so then you can say there's only one justice. So it's fascinating to hear that these judges can have different opinions. Well, if there's only one truth, how can there be multiple opinions?
Well, see, that's just it. And this is part of why, again, I go right back to the fact that the system is completely ambiguous. And by ambiguous, I do mean that anything and everything, every word can be interpreted multiple different ways.
Yep.
This is part of why I'm so, in any kind of given interaction with so-called government agents, whatever, and, pick and choose your battles. But when the meat's really on the line, you better be ready to question every freaking word. What do you mean by that? Shut up. Let them define whatever it is. Don't offer up any explanations or definitions, because now you're going to have to prove it. Let them make their claims. Let them define whatever it is. And then as soon as they're done, simply ask, okay, where's your evidence of that? And if they're making a claim against you, where's your evidence that I'm what you say? Period. End of story. And again, just shut up and let them produce their evidence. And until they can produce their evidence in real tangible evidence, not hearsay and assertions. Because if they're coming up with hearsay and assertions, you question the shit out of it until you blow that. It's just that simple.
So there's one more area that I want to go into, and then I think we should probably get into the public discourse side of this, because I think that's probably where we're going to have the most interesting conversation tonight, I believe, is going to be in the after show. But there is one thing I want to dive on, and I want to really pass this to Debo. I think this is going to be a specialty. And to kind of set the stage for this, I'll give you my opinion. My opinion is that none of this matters if it was not for the threat of violence against your life and your possessions through the barrel of a gun of a police officer. If it was not for the police that are there to enforce these laws, and at the end of that enforcement, it can lead up to the death, to your death, or at minimum kidnapping you and throwing you in a cage. No matter what the crime is, any law that they write, it can be enforced up into physical violence. So, and I'm not saying that that's Debo's opinion as well, but I do want to pass this to him and just kind of see what's your take on this, Debo? You deal with police officers quite often, so I just want to sort of get your input on that.
Yeah, so I guess what the police are doing so much, their job is to enforce the written will of a group of people they've likely never met. And they do this under the guise that it's just and, well, basically because they can get away with it and they get a paycheck. So that kind of, in their mind, validates it. But yeah, I guess it doesn't, like, the big problem is that it's all done by means of physical force or threat of violence through the barrels of their guns. I would agree. Other than that, I don't really see much problem. Like, I like the services. There are a lot of other people like the services that are provided too. I don't know. It's just the violence that's the problem. And I've never agreed to have this happen to me. And people will say, well, you do just by being here. Well, do you have any kind of facts to show that that's true?
So part of it to me, though, is that government, it all sort of looks like one big circular fallacy, right? Because if you ask the police officer, what gives you authority to tell me what to do, they would say, well, the government gives me authority. But if I go and I ask the government, what gives you any legitimacy whatsoever, the reality is that the government, the only reason why it has any legitimacy at all is because of the police officer. So the police officer gives government legitimacy and the government gives the police officer legitimacy. It just seems like one big circular fallacy to me.
Yeah, or they'll say, oh, well, my authority is based on the Constitution. Okay, what authorized this Constitution over me? Do you have any kind of facts to show that that's true? And then, oh, no, they. Like, I've got a police chief on record saying that he doesn't have any kind of factual evidence to show that the laws which he enforces every day actually apply to people.
Of course not. And I don't know where that could ever come from, right? I mean, and probably good. That's probably a good thing. But I mean, what type of so even if we look at the IRS tax code, you say, well, the IRS tax code applies to you because the IRS tax code says it applies to you, right? Where could anything ever come from to prove and provide evidence that somebody else has a greater claim over your life and property? That cannot exist because it contradicts just natural law of the world. There is nothing that gives one person authority over you. That just is not self-evident that one man or a group of men can have any kind of authority over you. There's no reason why I should have a higher claim to Cliff's life and his possessions than he does himself. There's nothing in society or in that you can observe naturally that gives me that right or gives anyone else that right.
Yeah, unless you can prove it. If you can prove that you have a legitimate claim on my property, then where's the evidence? It's simple. And I mean, this is really what the foundation of, you could say, rights are, because it's right that we agree. It's not right that we disagree, but it's not totally wrong that we disagree. We equally say it's not right to disagree because we disagree. So if we do agree, then it's right.
Well, there's a couple things here, and this gets into the contractual language. And again, this is part of why I say, too, that whenever we speak, we should be reading out of the legal dictionary, not the formal dictionary, so that we know what we're really saying in a legal sense. And particularly when it comes to not knowing and understanding certain words, like that word understand. Words that will play into this, and sometimes it's not even the words, it's the actions. Now, one of the legal maxims is he who will be deceived, let him. And this gets all the way into contracts, which means that a contract is offered up, it's a completely fraudulent contract. It does not make the contract automatically void, it makes it voidable. Now, if you consent to the because if you happen to like the services you're getting and you don't mind being lied to and some of this other stuff, basic status, patriot, where they know there's issues, but they still want all their others. Okay, well, then there is no fraud. There is no fraud. Now, for those of us there is a fraud and we call on it, should we be pretty much automatically relieved of any of that? Yes, we should. We technically should. But because of the way the system is, it's also designed to be a big test, which then gets into something that is really getting back to a real test of knowing who you are as a player in the game. So kind of is it right there, in my opinion, because it is about contracts. As much as a lot of people don't like to admit it, there's contracts everywhere. The basic government is set up as a trust. All corporations are set up as a trust. The basic name, or so-called person, is the beneficiary in the trust. All government agents are the trustees, the only ones that are bound to perform. And the only right that you really have outside of your common law, you don't touch me, I don't touch you kind of stuff, is your contract. And your contract, within the contract, is your rights. That's where your rights are. It's in your terms and conditions.
So could it be then that one of the remedies, if done correctly, is proof of breach of trust?
Proof of breach of contract.
Yeah.
Because that's where it's going to come down to, because there won't be a breach of the trust. What they're going to get you to do through their words and your lack of knowledge and asking the right questions, they're going to shift position from them being the trustee to you being the trustee. That's why inmates are called trustees.
Yep.
Because they've now shifted position. This is why Chief Justice Robert Bork said everybody that's in prison today consented to it. They volunteered for it. They didn't necessarily know when and how they did it, but they did it anyway. Even when they thought that they were completely fighting against it, because there were certain things that they still did where their actions spoke louder than words.
Lack of education?
Yeah, buddy. Yeah, buddy. That's
See,
it right there.
Yeah, it all proves, a lot of this proves that the whole problem we have in the world today is lack of education. The education we get is sugar-coated with a lot of lies, basically,
Right.
and misleading, yeah.
Right. But of course, and this is one of the things that I like about particularly using contract law is some of the analogy on this, because the same as in a contract, if you and I enter into a contract, Cliff, if we kind of spell out the terms and conditions and we agree, but yet you don't specifically know what I mean by one word or another, it's not on me to know, number one, know that you don't know what I mean by these words. So
Correct.
it's not foreseeable for me to even know that I should ask, but there's no obligation for me to ask either. He who will be deceived, let him. It's entirely on the individual in the part as the real party in interest to be sure of what they're getting into, to ask questions, question every word. So, the education is out there. All the information is out there. And of course, some of this stuff, and particularly as you and I have talked about the symbology of things, some of this stuff is blaringly right in everyone's face. The old saying, the best place to hide things is right out in the open. Well, some of this stuff is right there.
Absolutely.
For those that have eyes to see and ears to hear.
Yep. Like we said the other night, perception seems to be the thing that has been skewed so that people can't see it.
Well, yeah, and of course, as long as I got my beer on my flat screen, I'm going to ignore the big old elephant in the room that's actually holding up my beer on my flat screen. I'll completely ignore the elephant that's holding up the whole damn thing that I'm paying the most attention to. Because they can literally put it right. Because some of the stuff that we talk about, some of the symbolism and some of the key elements, even in your football games and some of the advertisements and these other things, it's all right there. They're telling you if you know what to look for. Most people don't know what to look for. So, yeah, it gets back to the day of information, and ignorance is at its highest that I think it's ever been. We're in the day of information, and you go back to like Spooner's time or Henry David Thoreau's time. Henry David Thoreau, from what I remember, that man spoke like 8 languages by the time he was 12 years old. Oh my God. The level of education, again, goes right back to our public education. Back in the old days when everybody was homeschooled, the education level was pretty freaking high for those that actually valued education. Those that didn't, it is what it is. But yeah, so much of this goes right back to the early days, the molding of the young minds. I forget who it was that said it, but you give me a man for the first 6 years of his life, I'll have him for the rest of his life. I don't care what the rest of you do. He will be mine forever. And that's true, because that's that first molding, those first few years that are the most critical. I don't necessarily fully understand and agree with the Japanese on this, but their philosophy, their tradition is you do not physically or verbally punish a child until after the age of 6.
Well, hey guys, let's I'm going to shut this one down. We're going to go ahead and move over to the live voice chat here in just a moment, because I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation actually passing this over. If you guys contradict anything that we've said tonight especially, I want you to come in to the live voice, have this conversation with us. We can have a productive debate. Okay, we can look at these things and ask the right questions, and we can have a productive debate. This is the place to do it, because I can assure you we will not get heated, and it will not be like those debates that you see on Facebook or Twitter, or even some of the other Discord servers. When you talk to us, it's a rational conversation. We answer questions, and that's what we're here for, especially on the server. That's what we're looking for. So by all means, don't be afraid to come forward and say, I disagree. I think that we have to have these things or those things, or I don't think that that's the right kind of system. I don't think that society could exist without government. That's perfectly fine. Come in, express your thoughts, and let us know. Now, however, if you are new, if you've never been here before, or if you're on YouTube and you've never come into the Discord server, first and foremost, go to the description of the video in the live stream. There's a link there to join the Discord server. You can join that. If you're not already on Discord, of course, you'll have to create an account and all that first. Once you do that, you can come in, find the I'm going to show it to you right here, the pre-screening text chat. You'll have to send a message in there. We'll have to give you a role that will allow you to actually speak in the live voice chat, okay? And that goes for a lot of you guys here as well. That role allows you to actually type or text in this live stream text chat, so it does not allow you if you don't have that role, and it will not allow you to actually speak in the live voice. So you need to let us know that you would like to do those things so that we can give you the appropriate role to do so, okay? So here in a moment, we're going to be jumping over here to live voice. So if you guys are watching live, go ahead and start making your way there now. And we're going to start up another live stream. It's going to be the same thing, except it's going to be the after show. So before we go, I just want to give everyone an opportunity. One of these guys and Debo, thank you guys for coming on. Do you guys have any final statements that you'd like to put out there?
Thanks for having me on. Like to do it again sometime. And I'll see you guys over in the live chat if anyone's got.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll just close with this Graeber quote. If you're in a line to board a crowded bus and you don't elbow your way to the front of the line in absence of a cop, you're already living as an anarchist.
Nice one.
Nice.
Good one. Okay, thank you. Thanks, people that have shown up for this, and we'll see you next time.
See you on the flip side.
Yes, sir. See y'all later.